The dust hung in the air like a veil between the world and the sky, golden in the late afternoon sun that beat down on the small Kansas town of Sweetwater. James Cordell walked his horse slowly down the main street, his shadow stretching long behind him, a dark ribbon on the packed earth. He was tired, bone-tired, the kind of weariness that settles into a man's soul after too many miles and too many years of carrying burdens that were never meant to be carried alone. His hat was pulled low, all from habit and necessity, shading eyes that had seen too much and revealed too little. The war had ended 3 years ago, but James carried it with him still, in the stiffness of his left shoulder where a Confederate bullet had found its mark, in the way he startled at sudden sounds, in the emptiness that had taken root where hope once grew. He was 32 years old, and felt ancient. Sweetwater looked like 100 other towns he would pass through since mustering out, a collection of weathered buildings clinging to existence on the edge of the endless prairie. A general store, a church with a modest steeple, a boarding house, a livery stable, and a saloon that had seen better days, respectable enough, quiet enough, forgettable enough, just the way James preferred it. He would been drifting for months now, taking work where he could find it, never staying long enough to put down roots or answer questions about where he would come from or where he was going. The truth was, he did not know the answer to either question anymore. Tennessee felt like another lifetime, and the farm he would left behind was nothing but ashes and memories he could not bear to revisit. His wife, Sarah, had been buried there before he would even made it home from Appomattox. The consumption had taken her while he was fighting for a cause that had ultimately cost him everything. James dismounted in front of the livery, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. His horse, sturdy roan gelding named Ulysses, nickered softly and nudged his shoulder. At least the horse was loyal, patient, asking nothing but feed and water, and the kind word now and then. More than most people offered, James thought, running his hand along the animal's neck. The livery was dim and cool inside, smelling of hay and leather and horse sweat. An old man with a shock of white hair emerged from the shadows, wiping his hands on a rag that had once been red but was now the indeterminate color of age and use. "Help you, stranger, need to board my horse for a few days," James said, his voice rough from disuse. He did not talk much these days. "And I am looking for work. Anything available around here?" The old man sized him up with eyes that had seen their share of drifters and dreamers. "Might be. You good with your hands?" "Good enough. There is a widow woman on the edge of town. Runs a small farm. Heard she has been looking for help since her husband passed last winter. Name's Eleanor Whitmore. Place is about a mile east. Got a white fence around it. Or what is left of one, anyway." The old man took Ulysses's reins, running an appraising hand down the horse's legs. "This is a fine animal. You take good care of him. He has earned it," James said simply. He paid the man for 3 days in advance, shouldering his saddlebags and rifle. "The boarding house take in travelers? Mrs. Henderson does. Clean rooms, decent food, and she do not ask questions." The old man grinned, showing gaps where teeth used to be. "Seems like that might suit you." James nodded his thanks and stepped back into the sunshine that felt too bright, too cheerful for the shadows he carried. He made his way to the boarding house, a 2-story structure that had been painted yellow once upon a time, but had faded to the color of old butter. Miss Henderson was a plump woman with kind eyes and flour on her apron. She showed him to a small room on the 2nd floor with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the street. "Supper's at 6, she said. "You look like you could use a good meal, Mr. Cordell." He wondered how she knew his name until he realized he must have given it at some point. The days had a way of blurring together lately. He thanked her and closed the door, sitting heavily on the bed and removing his hat. The mirror above the washstand showed him a stranger, a man with dark hair shot through with premature gray, a lean face marked by sun and hardship, eyes that used to be clear blue but now seemed clouded with things better left unspoken. He did not go down for supper. Instead, he lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the town settling in for evening, wondering why he would stop here at all, wondering if there was any point to keep moving when there was nowhere he wanted to go. Sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams of smoke and thunder, of Sarah's face pale against white sheets, of a home that existed only in memory now. Morning arrived with the crowing of a rooster somewhere nearby, insistent and cheerful in a way that made James want to pull the pillow over his head. But old habits died hard, and he was up with the sun, washing in cold water from the pitcher, shaving carefully with the straight razor that had been his father's. The face in the mirror looked slightly more human, if no less haunted. He found coffee downstairs, thick and strong and hot, exactly what he needed. Miss Henderson bustled about, setting out breakfast for her handful of boarders, and James ate mechanically, tasting nothing, simply fueling the body that kept insisting on living, even when his spirit had given up the fight. The walk to the Whitmore farm took him through town, and out into open country where the prairie grass rolled away to the horizon, like an ocean frozen in place. The morning air was fresh and cool, carrying the scent of wildflowers and earth, and despite himself, James felt something in his chest loosen just slightly. The land here was different from Tennessee, flatter, wider, more exposed, but there was a beauty to it that crept up on a man when he was not paying attention. The white fence came into view, sagging in places, broken in others, surrounding a modest homestead that consisted of a small house, a barn that needed repairs, a chicken coop, and several outbuildings in various states of disrepair. The fields beyond showed signs of cultivation, but also of struggle, rows that were not quite straight, weeds winning battles here and there. It was the kind of place that whispered of hard work and harder times, of dreams that required more hands than one person possessed. James stood at the gate for a moment, his hand on the weathered wood, suddenly uncertain. What was he doing here? He was no farmer, not anymore. He was a drifter, a man trying to outrun his own shadow. But the old man at the livery had mentioned work, and James needed to eat, needed to keep moving, needed something to fill the hours that stretched endlessly before him. A woman emerged from the house before he could turn away. She was in her late 20s, he guessed, with honey-colored hair pulled back, in a practical bun, and a plain gray dress that had been mended more than once. She moved with purpose, carrying a basket on her hip, but there was a weariness to her shoulders that James recognized, because he wore it himself. "Can I help you?" she called out. Shading her eyes against the sun, James removed his hat. "Ma'am, I am James Cordell, man deliveries. Said you might be looking for someone to help around the place." She studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Up close, James could see that she was younger than he would first thought, perhaps not yet 30, but her eyes held the kind of age that had nothing to do with years and everything to do with sorrow weathered and survived. "I am," she said finally. "Though I should warn you, I cannot pay much. Room and board in the barn, and what little cash I can spare the end of each week. That will do," James said. The barn would be fine. He would slept in worse places, and solitude suited him these days. Eleanor Whitmore nodded slowly, still taking his measure. "I should tell you, Miss Cordell, it is not just me here. I have a son. He is 4 years old. This is a respectable household, and I will expect—" "Ma'am," James interrupted gently, "I am just looking for honest work." Nothing more, nothing less. Something in her face softened slightly, as if she would heard the truth in his words, or perhaps recognized fellow soul carrying burdens too heavy to name. "All right then, let me show you around, and you can decide if you still want the job after you have seen what needs doing." The tour was sobering. The barn roof leaked in 3 places. The chicken coop needed reinforcing before winter came. The fields required weeding, and the harvest would need to be brought in within the next few weeks. The well pump was stubborn and threatened to give out entirely. Fences needed mending. The list went on and on. A catalog of tasks that would have challenged 3 men, let alone one widow trying to do it all alone. "My husband, Thomas, he was planning to hire help last spring," Eleanor said, as they stood in the barn, looking up at the holes in the roof, where sunlight streamed through. But then he got sick, and everything just... She trailed off, her voice catching. I have been doing what I can, but it is not enough. It is never enough. James understood that feeling, the sense that no matter how hard you worked, how much you tried, you were always falling short of some invisible mark. I can start on the roof today, he said. It will need some lumber and tar paper. I saw a timber yard in town. I can pay for materials, Eleanor said quickly. I am not asking for charity, Mr. Cordell. Did not think you were. James looked around the barn, mentally cataloging what he would need. It was good to focus on practical things, on problems that could actually be solved with hammer and nails. I will get my gear from town and start this afternoon. They were walking back toward the house when a small figure appeared in the doorway, and James felt his heart do something unexpected and painful in his chest. The boy was tiny, barely tall enough to reach the door handle, with a mop of dark hair and enormous eyes that seemed too large for his thin face. He wore overalls that had been patched at the knees and a shirt that might have been white once, but had faded to gray. Mama? The voice was small and uncertain. It is all right, sweetie. Come meet Mr. Cordell. He is going to be helping us around the farm. Eleanor's voice transformed when she spoke to her son, becoming warmer, gentler, filled with a love that was almost painful to witness. The boy crept forward slowly, one small hand gripping the doorframe as if it were a lifeline. He stared up at James with those huge eyes, and James found himself looking away, unable to hold that innocent gaze. This is Tommy, Eleanor said, placing a protective hand on her son's shoulder. Tommy, can you say hello? Hello, the boy whispered, so quietly James almost did not hear it. Hello, Tommy, James managed, his voice rougher than he intended. He cleared his throat. I will just head back to town then. Get what I need. He turned and walked away quickly, feeling those eyes on his back, feeling something pop in the walls he would so carefully built around himself. A child. Of course there was a child. The universe had a cruel sense of humor sometimes. As he walked back to Sweetwater, James tried not to think about the son he would never had, the children Sarah had dreamed of, but never carried to term, the family that was supposed to be his future, but had died before it ever had a chance to begin. He tried not to think about how fragile that little boy had looked, how the shadows under his eyes spoke of his own losses, how he would clung to his mother like she was the only solid thing in a world that had proven itself treacherous. He tried not to think about any of it, but the trying itself was a kind of thinking, and by the time he reached town, James Cordell felt more tired than he had in months. The afternoon sun was merciless as James worked on the barn roof, his shirt soaked with sweat, his hands already developing new blisters on top of old calluses. The physical labor was welcome, though a way to exhaust the body so the mind might finally quiet. He would always been good with his hands, had learned carpentry from his father before the war changed everything, and the familiar rhythm of hammer striking nail was almost meditative. From his vantage point on the roof, he could see Eleanor working in the garden near the house, pulling weeds and checking on vegetables that struggled in the Kansas heat. She moved efficiently, wasting no motion, and James recognized the economy of someone who would learn to stretch each day's energy as far as it would go. The boy appeared now and then, a small shadow flitting between house and garden, never straying far from his mother. James tried not to watch, tried to keep his focus on the task at hand, but his eyes betrayed him, drawn to the child in a way that made his chest ache. Mr. Cordell? Eleanor's voice drifted up from below. I have brought some water. You must be parched up there. James climbed down the ladder carefully, his shoulder protesting the unfamiliar angle of the work. Eleanor stood in the shade of the barn, holding a tin cup that beaded with condensation. Tommy peeked out from behind her skirts, watching James with those solemn eyes. Much obliged, James said, taking the cup and draining half of it, one long swallow. The water was cool and sweet, probably from a spring somewhere. It tasted like life itself. You work fast, Eleanor observed, looking up at the roof. Thomas always said you could tell a man by his work. He would have liked you, I think. James did not know what to say to that, So he said nothing, just finished the water, and handed back the cup. His eyes met Tommy's for a brief moment, and the boy ducked back behind his mother, suddenly shy. "He is not used to strangers," Eleanor said softly. "We do not get many visitors out here." "I understand." James did understand, more than she knew. He was good with solitude himself, preferred it, even. But something about the isolation of this place, this woman and child alone at the edge of the world, struck him as wrong somehow, dangerous even. "Ma'am, if you do not mind me asking, do you have any neighbors nearby? Anyone who checks in on you?" Eleanor's expression shuddered slightly. "The town does what it can. Miss Henderson brings by provisions sometimes. The Reverend visits when he makes his rounds. We manage." There was pride in her voice, but also something brittle, something that suggested managing was costing more than she wanted to admit. James recognized that too. He would be managing for 3 years now, and it had worn him down to bare bones and borrowed time. "I will get back to it," he said, turning toward the ladder. But a small voice stopped him. "Are you a cowboy?" James froze, then slowly turned back. Tommy had emerged fully from behind his mother's skirts and was staring up at him with open curiosity now, the shyness temporarily overcome by childhood wonder. "Tommy," Eleanor said gently, "Miss Cordell is working. It is all right." James crouched down slowly, bringing himself closer to the boy's level, though he kept a respectful distance. "I suppose I am, in a way. I have worked with horses and cattle. Why do you ask?" "I saw your hat," Tommy said, pointing to where James had left it on a fence post. "Cowboys have hats like that. In my book." "You have a book about cowboys?" Tommy nodded vigorously. "Mama reads it to me. There is pictures. The cowboys save people from bad men, and find lost horses, and sleep under the stars." James felt something twist inside him. "That is in stories, son. Real cowboys mostly just work hard and get dirty and tired." "Oh." Tommy's face fell slightly, and James immediately regretted his words. What was wrong with him, crushing a child's innocent imaginings? "But," James added quickly, "sleeping under the stars is real enough. That part's true. And I have found a few lost horses in my time." Tommy's face brightened again. "Really? Really?" James stood, feeling Eleanor's eyes on him, wondering what she saw. "Now I would better get back to work before the sun sets." As he climbed the ladder, he heard Tommy ask his mother, "Is he going to stay, Mama?" Eleanor's answer was too quiet for James to hear, but he found himself wondering the same thing. Was he going to stay? He never stayed. Staying meant putting down roots, and roots could be torn up too easily, leaving wounds that never quite healed. Better to keep drifting, keep moving, keep the world at arm's length, where it could not hurt him anymore. But as the afternoon wore on and the roof slowly took shape beneath his hands, James found his thoughts returning again and again to the woman working in the garden and the small boy who asked about cowboys and dreams. There was something about this place, this broken-down farm at the edge of nowhere, that calls you a part of him he would thought was dead and buried alongside Sarah and everything else he would lost. By the time the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, James had finished patching 2 of the 3 holes in the roof. His hands were raw, his shoulders screaming, but there was a satisfaction in seeing solid work done, in knowing that when the next rain came, at least part of this barn would stay dry. He climbed down as shadows lengthened across the yard, stretching and groaning, as his body reminded him he was not as young as he used to be. Eleanor had gone inside, but she would left a plate covered with a cloth on a bench near the barn door. James lifted the cloth to find thick slices of bread, cheese, cold chicken, and an apple. His throat tightened at the simple kindness of it. He ate slowly, savoring each bite not because the food was fancy, but because it was offered freely, without expectation, a small gesture of human decency in a world that seemed increasingly short on such things. Through the window of the house, he could see lamplight glowing warm and golden, could hear the faint sound of Eleanor's voice reading, probably that cowboy book Tommy had mentioned. James finished his meal and made his way to the barn, where Eleanor had shown him he could sleep in the loft. Someone, probably her, had left blankets there, and a pillow that smelled faintly of lavender. He spread them out in the hay, creating a makeshift bed that was actually more comfortable than many places he would slept recently. He lay down fully clothed except for his boots, his rifle within easy reach out of habit, and stared up at the barn raptors he would spend the day repairing. Moonlight filtered through the remaining hole in the roof, painting silver patterns across the hay. Sleep was a long time coming, his mind refusing to settle, circling around thoughts of the woman who had lost her husband, the boy who had lost his father, the farm that needed more than one man could give. He thought about Sarah, as he did every night, but tonight the memory felt different somehow, less like a fresh wound and more like an old scar that might, eventually, become bearable. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called, and James finally drifted off to the sound of wind in the grass, the shifting of horses in their stalls below, the quiet breathing of a world settling into sleep. When morning came, he woke to find Tommy standing at the top of the loft ladder, clutching a small wooden horse, and watching James with those enormous eyes. "Good morning," James said carefully, sitting up and reaching for his boots. "Does your mama know you are out here?" Tommy shook his head, then nodded, then seemed confused about which answer was true. "She is making breakfast. I wanted to see if you were real." "Real?" James pulled on his first boot. "As opposed to what?" "I dreamed about you," Tommy said simply. "Sometimes when I dream about people, they go away when I wake up. Papa went away." The words landed like a blow to James's chest. He stopped with his second boot half on, staring at this child, who had articulated something profound and heartbreaking, with the casual honesty only children possessed. "I am real," James said quietly. "And I am not going anywhere. Not today, anyway. What about tomorrow? What about tomorrow?" It was a question James had been asking himself for 3 years now, never finding an answer that satisfied. But looking at Tommy's small face, seeing the hope and fear warring there, James found himself saying something he had not planned. "Tomorrow, too. I will be here tomorrow, too." Tommy considered this, and slowly nodded, as if sealing a pact between them. He held out the wooden horse, a crude thing that had been carved with more love than skill. "This was Papa's when he was little. Mama says he would want me to have it." "That is a fine horse," James said, taking it carefully and examining it with the seriousness it deserved. "Your papa must have been a good man." "Mama cries sometimes," Tommy whispered, as if sharing a terrible secret. "At night, she thinks I am asleep, but I hear her." A's hands tightened on the wooden horse, his throat closing. What could he say to this child, who had already learned that the world was a place where fathers disappeared and mothers cried in the darkness? What comfort could a broken man offer to a broken boy? "Your mama loves you very much," James finally said, handing back the horse. "And crying does not mean she is not strong. Sometimes the strongest people cry the most, because they are brave enough to feel everything." Tommy tucked the horse against his chest. "Are you strong?" The question caught James off guard. Was he strong? He would survive the war, survive losing Sarah, survive 3 years of drifting through a world that no longer made sense. But survival was not the same as strength, was it? "I am trying to be," James answered honestly. "Me too," Tommy said solemnly, and in that moment, James felt something shift in his chest, some wall beginning to crumble that he would build to protect himself from exactly this kind of connection, this dangerous caring about another human being. "We should get you back to your mama," James said, standing and retrieving his hat. "She is probably wondering where you are." They climbed down the ladder together, James going first and steadying Tommy as the boy descended, his small hands gripping each rung with fierce concentration. Outside, the morning was fresh and new, the sun just clearing the horizon, painting everything in shades of gold and promise. Eleanor appeared in the doorway of the house, relief flooding her face when she saw Tommy. "There you are. I told you not to bother Mr. Cordell." "He is not bothering me," James said, surprised to find it was true. We were just having a conversation about cowboys, Tommy added helpfully, and being strong. Eleanor's eyes met James's over her son's head, and something passed between them, an understanding that went beyond words. She knew what it cost James to engage with her son, even if she did not know the specific reasons why. And James knew what it cost her to trust a stranger with her child, with this precious piece of her heart that walked around outside her body. "Breakfast is ready," Eleanor said. "Mr. Cordell, you are welcome to join us. It is just porridge and eggs. Nothing fancy." James almost declined. He would plan to keep his distance, to remain the hired hand, nothing more. But Tommy was looking up at him with those hopeful eyes, and Eleanor's expression suggested that refusal would be noticed and might hurt, and James found himself nodding. "I would be grateful for a hot meal, ma'am." The kitchen was small and warm, smelling of coffee and frying eggs, and something sweeter, maybe cinnamon. James sat at the modest table, feeling oversized and out of place in this domestic space. But Eleanor moved around him with practiced efficiency, setting plates and pouring coffee, while Tommy chattered about his wooden horse and whether James thought real horses liked to eat apples. "They do," James confirmed, accepting a plate laden with more food than he would expected. "Most horses will do just about anything for an apple or a carrot." "Can I feed your horse an apple?" Tommy asked eagerly. "The one at the livery?" "Tommy," Eleanor warned, "you know we do not go into town without me." "Maybe sometime," James said carefully. "If it is all right with your mama, I could bring Ulysses out here. He is gentle. You could feed him then." Tommy's face lit up like the sun breaking through clouds, and James felt a painful squeeze in his chest. It was such a small thing, promising to bring a horse by, but the boy reacted as if he would been offered the moon. They ate in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the clink of forks on plates and the distant crow of the rooster. James found himself relaxing slightly, the warmth of the kitchen and the simple goodness of the food working their way past his defenses. "Mr. Cordell," Eleanor said finally, setting down her coffee cup, "I should tell you something about why I really need help here." James looked up from his plate, noting the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands wrapped around the cup, as if seeking warmth despite the summer heat. "Thomas did not just get sick," she continued, her voice low and steady, fretted with pain. "He was hurt. There was an accident with a horse, and he fell, hit his head. He lingered for 3 weeks before," she swallowed hard, "before he passed." "I am sorry," James said, and meant it. "The town. Most folks have been kind, but some." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Some think a woman alone should not be trying to run a farm. They have made offers to buy the land, and when I refuse, they made it clear I was not welcome to ask for help. I am telling you this because I do not want you walking into town and hearing gossip or getting into trouble on my account." James set down his fork, understanding dawning. "Who made the offers?" "Carl Mitchell. He owns the bank and half the businesses in Sweetwater. His son, Robert, he would been interested in me before I married Thomas. When Thomas died, Robert came calling again. I made it clear I was not interested, and his father took it personally." Eleanor's hands tightened on her cup. "I can pay you, Mr. Cordell, but I cannot promise you will not face some hostility from certain quarters." James considered this. He would face worse than small-town politics, have wounded pride. But he appreciated her honesty, her willingness to lay out the situation clearly. It spoke to her character. "I am not concerned about gossip, ma'am, and I do not take well to bullies, whatever form they come in." He met her eyes directly. "If you are asking whether this changes my mind about working here, it does not. I gave you my word for at least tomorrow, and I am good for it." Something in Eleanor's expression softened, a tension releasing that he had not fully noticed until it was gone. "Thank you. That means more than you know." Tommy, who would be listening with the intensity of a child trying to understand adult conversations, piped up suddenly. "Are bad men going to come?" "No, sweetie," Eleanor said quickly, reaching over to ruffle his hair. "No bad men. Just some people who do not understand that Mama can take care of us just fine." But Tommy's eyes had gone to James, wide and worried. "Will you protect us, like the cowboys in my book?" And there it was, the question James had been dreading without knowing it was coming. A child asking for protection, for certainty, for promises that the world had taught James could never truly be kept. He could lie, could offer easy reassurance, but he would never be good at lying, even to himself. "I will do my best," James said finally. "But your mama, she is already doing a fine job of protecting you. She is strong and smart, and she does not need saving, just maybe a little help fixing the fence." It was the right answer, judging by the grateful look Eleanor gave him, and the way Tommy seemed to accept it, returning his attention to his eggs with the easy resilience of childhood. After breakfast, James returned to the barn roof, while Eleanor and Tommy went about their morning chores. The day stretched ahead, full of honest work and simple rhythms, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, James Cordell found himself thinking not about yesterday or the day before, but about tomorrow, and maybe even the day after that. The days began to take on a rhythm that James had not experienced since before the war, a pattern of rising with the sun and working until his body demanded rest, of meals shared at Eleanor's table, and evenings spent in the barn loft, listening to the sounds of the farm settling into sleep. It was a simple existence, almost monotonous, and yet James found something approaching peace in the repetition, in the way each task completed led naturally to the next. By the end of the first week, he would finish the barn roof and moved on to the chicken coop, reinforcing the walls and replacing rotted boards. Tommy appeared regularly, maintaining a careful distance at first, but gradually creeping closer, his curiosity overcoming his shyness. The boy would sit on an overturned bucket and watch James work, sometimes talking, sometimes silent, always clutching the wooden horse his father had carved. "Why do you check every nail?" Tommy asked one afternoon, his small voice cutting through the steady rhythm of James's hammer. James paused, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Because one weak nail can cause the whole thing to fail. It is not enough to do the work. You have to do it right, or you will just end up having to do it again." "Papa used to say that," Tommy said softly. "Mama says he was very particular about things. Sounds like he was a wise man." James selected another nail, positioned it carefully. "What else did your papa say?" Tommy was quiet for a moment, his small face scrunched in concentration. "He said that being a man meant keeping your promises, even when it is hard." "Especially when it is hard." The boy's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "He promised to teach me to ride a horse when I got bigger, but that he could not." James felt the words like a physical blow. He set down his hammer and turned to face Tommy fully, seeing the confusion and hurt in those two old eyes. The way this child was trying to make sense of a world that had broken its most important promise. "Your papa did not break his promise," James said carefully. "Sometimes things happen that are beyond anyone's control. That does not mean the promise was not real, or that your papa did not mean it with all his heart." "But he still left," Tommy said, and there was such simple devastation in those three words that James had to look away. He did not want to leave. "That much I can promise you." James picked up the hammer again, needing something to do with his hands. "And I bet he would be proud of how brave you are being, how you are helping your mama and being strong." "I am not strong," Tommy said miserably. "I get scared at night, and sometimes I forget what Papa looked like, and that makes me feel bad." James stopped working entirely now, setting down his tools and sitting on the ground so he was at Tommy's level. This was dangerous territory, engaging this deeply, caring this much, but he could not seem to help himself. "Listen to me," James said quietly. "Being scared does not mean you are not strong. And forgetting what someone looked like, that is just what happens with time. It does not mean you have forgotten who they were or how much they loved you. Those things, the important things, they stay here." He tapped his own chest, over his heart, where it matters. Tommy studied him with those enormous eyes. "Do you forget people?" "Yes," James admitted. "I do." Does it make you sad? Sometimes. But I try to remember that the people we love, they become part of us. Even when they are gone, they are still there, in the things they taught us, the way they loved us, the memories we carry. It was the most James had said about loss to anyone since Sarah died, and speaking the words aloud felt both painful and oddly liberating, like lancing a wound that had festered too long. Tommy considered this gravely, then nodded as if James had confirmed something important. "I think Papa would like you," he said finally. "Mama does." Before James could figure out how to respond to that startling statement, Eleanor's voice called from the house, summoning Tommy for his afternoon lessons. The boy scampered off, leaving James sitting in the dirt, his heart doing strange and uncomfortable things in his chest. Mama does. What did that mean? Eleanor had been nothing but professional and polite, maintaining appropriate distance while still showing kindness. But James had caught her watching him sometimes when she thought he was not looking, had noticed the way she seemed to relax slightly when he was near, as if his presence provided some measure of security or comfort. He stood and brushed off his pants, trying to push the thoughts away. He was hired help, nothing more, getting tangled up in feelings, in hopes, in connections that felt too much like the beginnings of something he could not afford to want. That was a path to heartbreak. He would learn that lesson well enough already, but as the days continued to unspool, James found his resolve weakening despite his best efforts. There was Eleanor's laugh when Tommy did something unexpectedly charming, a sound like water over stones, rare enough to be precious. There was the way she moved through her days with quiet determination, never complaining about the endless work, the weight of responsibility she carried alone. There was her gentleness with her son, her fierce protection of this small piece of land and life she would build, her refusal to be driven away by small-minded men who thought women could not manage without masculine oversight. And there was Tommy himself, gradually emerging from his shell of shyness, like a flower opening to the sun. The boy began to talk more freely, to share his thoughts and dreams and fears with a trust that terrified James, even as it touched something deep in his soul. Tommy wanted to know about everything, about James's horse, about the war, though James deflected those questions, about what it was like to sleep under the stars, about whether James thought it was possible to fly if you wanted to. "I do not think people can fly," James said one evening, as they sat on the porch steps, watching the sun paint the sky, in shades of crimson and gold. "Not without wings, anyway." "But birds can," Tommy pointed out with childlike logic, "and they are smaller than us. So maybe if we wanted it enough, if we tried really hard, we could too." James smiled despite himself, charmed by the boy's determined optimism. "Maybe you are right. Maybe wanting something badly enough is its own kind of magic. Do you want things?" Tommy asked, tilting his head in a curious way he had. The question stopped James cold. Did he want things? He had been so focused on surviving, on getting through each day, that he would stop allowing himself to want anything beyond the basics. But sitting here on this porch, with his child beside him and the smell of Eleanor's cooking drifting from the kitchen, James realized that somewhere along the way, despite all his careful defenses, he would begun to want again. He wanted this farm to succeed. He wanted Eleanor to smile more and worry less. He wanted Tommy to grow up feeling safe and loved and certain of his place in the world. He wanted, God help him, to stop drifting and put down roots in this unexpected place with these unexpected people who would somehow slip past his walls. "Yes," James said finally, "I want things." "Like what?" "Like seeing you learn to ride a horse," James said, surprising himself with the admission. "I have been thinking, if it is all right with your mama, I could bring Ulysses out here soon. Start teaching you, nice and slow. Your papa would have wanted that for you." Tommy's face transformed, joy radiating from him like light. "Really? You mean it?" "I mean it." And James did, even though the promise scared him, even though it meant admitting he was staying, that he was becoming part of this family's life, in ways that went beyond hired help. Tommy threw his small arms around James's neck in an impulsive hug, and James froze for a moment before carefully, tentatively, returning the embrace. The boy felt impossibly fragile, all bird bones and trust, and James was struck by the terrifying responsibility of it, this child who had already lost one man he would counted on. Eleanor appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron, and her expression when she saw them made James's breath catch. There was something in her eyes, a softness mixed with fear, hope, tangled with weariness, that told him she felt it too, this dangerous thing growing between them all, this fragile possibility of becoming something more than strangers thrown together by circumstance. "Supper's ready," she said quietly. They ate together, as had become their custom, the conversation flowing more easily now than it had those first awkward days. Tommy chattered about learning to ride, about maybe having a horse of his own someday, about whether cowboys really sang songs to the cattle at night. Eleanor was quieter, but James caught her watching him again, and when their eyes met across the table, neither looked away immediately. After the meal, after Tommy had been tucked into bed with his wooden horse and story, James helped Eleanor wash the dishes, a domestic ritual that felt both foreign and strangely natural. They worked in companionable silence, her washing and him drying, and James was acutely aware of how close they stood, how occasionally their hands would brush as she passed him a plate. "He adores you," Eleanor said finally, her voice soft. "Tommy, I have never seen him take to someone so quickly." "He is a good boy," James said. "You have done well with him, especially considering." He trailed off, not wanting to bring up painful subjects. "Considering I am doing it alone?" Eleanor's tone was wry, but not bitter. "Some days I feel like I am barely keeping my head above water. Like one more thing going wrong will be the thing that drowns us all." James set down the dish he had been drying and turned to face her. "You are not alone. Not anymore." The words hung between them, heavy with implication, with meanings that went beyond simple hired help. Eleanor's hands stilled in the washwater, and she looked up at him with those eyes that had seen too much sorrow but had not lost the capacity for hope. "James," she said, using his first name for the first time, "I need to know. Are you staying? Real staying? Because Tommy, he is already attached to you, and if you are just going to leave when the work is done, I need to know now before he gets hurt." It was a fair question, asked with a mother's fierce protectiveness, and James respected her for it. She was right to be cautious, right to guard her son's heart. But standing there in her kitchen with the lamplight painting everything in warm gold, and the smell of home all around him, James found the truth rising up from somewhere deep and certain. "I am staying," he said, "for as long as you will have me." Something shifted in Eleanor's expression, a wall coming down, a door opening. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Why here? Why us?" James considered the question, trying to find words for things he barely understood himself. "Because I have been running for 3 years, and I am tired. Because this place, it feels like maybe I could stop running here. Because you and Tommy, you have reminded me that there are things worth staying for." Eleanor's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I lost Thomas," she whispered. I cannot go through that again. Losing someone. If you stay, if you become part of our lives, I need to know you mean it." James understood what she was asking, the courage it took to voice that fear. He thought about Sarah, about the promises they would made that death had interrupted, about the way love always came with the risk of loss. But he also thought about the alternative, about spending the rest of his life drifting alone, never connecting, never whisking, never really living. "I cannot promise I will never leave," James said honestly. "None of us can promise that. Life has a way of taking those choices out of our hands. But I can promise that I will not leave by choice. I can promise that if I am staying, I am all in, no halfway measures." Eleanor studied his face for a long moment, searching for something, and whatever she found there must have satisfied her, because she nodded slowly. "All right then, all in." They stood there in the kitchen, the dishes forgotten, something unspoken but understood passing between them. This was not a declaration of love, not yet, but it was an acknowledgement of possibility, a decision to stop fighting the connection that had been growing since that first day when James had walked through the gate. The sound of hoofbeats outside shattered the moment, followed by rough voices and an inescapable sense of trouble arriving. Eleanor's face went pale, and James felt his body tense, old instincts from the war flooding back. "Stay here," he said quietly, already moving toward the door. "James. No, you do not understand." But James was already outside, stepping off the porch into the yard where 3 men on horseback had gathered. Even in the darkness, he recognized the type. Well-fed, well-dressed. The kind of men who were used to getting their way through money or intimidation or both. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" James asked, his voice level but carrying a warning. The man in the center, older than the other two, and clearly in charge, looked down at James with barely concealed disdain. "You must be the drifter Eleanor hired. I am Carl Mitchell. I own the bank in Sweetwater, and I am here on business." "Bit late for a business call," James observed, noting how the other 2 men, younger and harder looking, had positioned themselves to flank their boss. "I will conduct my business when I see fit." Mitchell's voice was cold. "I am here to make Mrs. Whitmore a final offer for this property. A generous offer, considering the state of things. The lady's not interested in selling." James kept his hands relaxed at his sides, but every sense was alert, reading the situation, calculating odds and angles, the way he would learn to do it. "I will hear that from her, not from some saddle tramp she has foolishly taken in." Mitchell's horse shifted, sensing its rider's agitation. "Eleanor, come out here and let us talk sensibly." Eleanor emerged from the house, and James could see the fear in her eyes, even as she lifted her chin with determined pride. "Mr. Mitchell, I have told you before, this farm is not for sale. Now please leave. You are frightening my son. Your son would be better off in town, in a proper situation, with a proper family. This is no life for a boy, Eleanor, out here with nothing but debt, and a hired man who will be gone in a week." Mitchell's voice took on a patronizing tone that made James's jaw clench. "Be reasonable. Take my offer. Move to town. And Robert will what?" Eleanor's voice shook but remained firm. "Court me? Marry me? Take on another man's son out of the goodness of his heart?" "I know what your son wants, Mr. Mitchell, and it has nothing to do with kindness." One of the younger men, who James now guessed was Robert Mitchell, urged his horse forward. "You watch your mouth, Eleanor. My father's trying to help you." "Help?" Eleanor laughed, a bitter sound. "You are trying to force me off land that belongs to me and my son. That is not help. That is theft dressed up in fancy words." "Theft?" Carl Mitchell's face darkened. "I hold a note on this property, woman. One more mispayment, the bank will foreclose. I am offering you a way out that lets you keep your dignity." James stepped forward, inserting himself between the mounted men and Eleanor. The ladies made her position clear. "Time for you to go." Robert Mitchell leaned down from his saddle, his face ugly with contempt. "And who are you to tell us anything? You think because you are fixing a few fences that makes you somebody? You are nothing. A nobody passing through." "Maybe so," James said quietly. "But I am a nobody, who is asking you politely to leave this property. Do not make me ask impolitely." The third man, who had been silent until now, moved his hand toward his belt, and James recognized the gesture of someone reaching for a weapon. In one smooth motion, James had his own pistol drawn, not pointing it at anyone, but making it clear he was armed and capable. "I would not," James said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had been in combat and knew exactly what he was doing. "I am not looking for trouble, but I will not let you threaten this family." For a long moment the tableau held, tension crackling in the air like lightning about to strike. Then Carl Mitchell raised his hand, stopping his companions from escalating further. "This is not over," Mitchell said coldly. "You have got 2 weeks, Eleanor. 2 weeks to make your payment, or this property becomes bank property." "And you," he fixed James with a hard stare. You would be wise to move along before you find yourself in the middle of something that is none of your concern. It became my concern the moment I started working here, James replied evenly. The three men wheeled their horses and rode off into the darkness, leaving James and Eleanor standing in the yard, the dust settling around them like the aftermath of a storm. James could hear his own heartbeat, could feel the adrenaline still singing through his veins, and it was a moment before he remembered to holster his weapon. Eleanor was shaking, her arms wrapped around herself. "I am sorry," she whispered. "I should have told you. The mortgage, the payment. I thought I could manage it, but with the harvest not quite ready." "And how much?" James asked quietly. "What? How much is the payment?" Eleanor named a figure that made James wince. It was not impossible, but it was not small either. "I have been saving every penny, but I am still short. I have most of it, but not enough." James's mind raced, calculating. He had money saved from 3 years of working and never spending, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots or invest in anything beyond basic necessities. It was money he would be saving without really knowing what for, a cushion against future disasters, or maybe just proof that he was still alive and functioning. "I can help," he said. "No." Eleanor's voice was sharp. "Absolutely not. I will not take your money, James. This is my problem." "It is our problem now," James said firmly. "You said all in, remember? That goes both ways." "This is different. This is what families do," James interrupted gently. "They help each other." Eleanor stared at him, and even in the dim light from the house, James could see tears tracking down her cheeks. "We are not a family," she whispered, but there was no conviction in her voice. "Are not we?" James asked. "Maybe not in the traditional sense. Not yet. But we are something. And whatever we are, it is worth fighting for." Before Eleanor could respond, a small voice called from the doorway. "Mama, I'm scared." Those men sounded angry. Tommy stood there in his nightshirt, the wooden horse clutched against his chest, his small face pale with fear. Eleanor hurried to him, gathering him up even though he was getting almost too big to carry comfortably. "It is all right, sweetie. The men are gone. We are safe now." But Tommy was looking at James over his mother's shoulder. "Are the bad men going to take our house?" James felt something pop wide open in his chest. He walked over to them, reaching out to ruffle Tommy's hair with a gentleness that would have surprised the men who had known him in the war. "No," James said, and it was a promise, a vow, a line drawn in the sand. "They are not going to take anything. I will not let them. Promise?" Tommy's voice was so small, so hopeful, so trusting. "Promise," James said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. The next morning, James rode into Sweetwater before dawn, his saddlebags heavy with coin he would retrieve from a bank 2 towns over. The streets were mostly empty, the town still sleeping, which suited him fine. He was not looking for confrontation, just resolution. The bank did not open until 9, so James waited on the bench outside, watching the town come to life around him. People passed, some nodding politely, others giving him curious or suspicious looks. Word had clearly spread about the stranger working at the Whitmore place, and James could imagine the gossip, the speculation about his presence and his intentions. When Carl Mitchell arrived to unlock the bank, his expression upon seeing James was one of displeasure mixed with grudging respect. "You are persistent. I will give you that. I am here to make Miss Whitmore's payment," James said simply. Mitchell's eyebrows rose. "That is her debt, not yours." Nevertheless, James followed the banker inside, waiting while Mitchell went through his morning routine of opening blinds and unlocking the vault. The bank was small, but prosperous-looking, all dark wood and brass fixtures, the kind of place that served as the beating heart of a small town's economy. Mitchell settled behind his desk and pulled out a ledger. "You understand that making this payment does not change anything. The debt remains, and next month there will be another payment due." "I understand." James counted out the money, watching as Mitchell's expression shifted from skepticism to surprise as the full amount appeared on the desk. "Where does a drifter get this kind of money?" Mitchell asked suspiciously. Honest work, James replied evenly. 3 years of wages saved. No law against that, is there? Mitchell counted the money slowly, meticulously, then made a notation in his ledger. No law against it, though it seems foolish, throwing away your savings on a widow's debt. That is my concern, not yours. James accepted the receipt Mitchell grudgingly provided, folding it carefully and tucking it into his pocket. I trust this makes Mrs. Whitmore's account current? For now. Mitchell leaned back in his chair, studying James with calculating eyes. You are planning to stay then? Make yourself permanent in the Whitmore household. It was not really a question, but James answered anyway. I am planning to stay. Eleanor Whitmore is a respectable woman, Mitchell said, and there was a warning in his tone. This town will not look kindly on any impropriety. James felt anger flare, but kept his voice level. Mrs. Whitmore's reputation is spotless, and it will stay that way. I am working her farm. Nothing more. For now. Mitchell echoed James's earlier words back at him with a knowing look. But you and I both know that is not all there is to it. My son is quite taken with Eleanor. Has been for years. Your presence complicates things. Your son needs to accept that the lady's not interested, James said flatly. That's not complicated at all. Mitchell's expression hardened. You are making enemies, Mr. Cordell. That is not wise in a small town. I am not looking to make enemies or friends, James replied. I am just looking to do right by people who have shown me kindness. He left the bank before Mitchell could respond, stepping back into the bright morning sunshine with the receipt burning like a promise in his pocket. He would done what needed doing, but he understood that this was not the end of it. Men like Carl Mitchell did not take kindly to being thwarted, and his son Robert would likely see James's presence as a challenge. But as James rode back toward the farm, watching the prairie grass ripple like water in the breeze, feeling Ulysses steady and sure beneath him, he found he was not afraid of what might come. For the first time in 3 years, he had something worth fighting for, something worth staying for, and that changed everything. Eleanor was in the garden when he arrived, and she straightened from her weeding when she heard his approach, shading her eyes against the sun. James dismounted and walked over to her, pulling the receipt from his pocket. The account is current, he said simply. Eleanor took the receipt with shaking hands, staring at it as if she could not quite believe what she was seeing. James, you should not have. This is too much. I cannot possibly. It is done, James said gently. We will figure out the rest as we go. But your savings, everything you have worked for. I worked for 3 years with no purpose, no direction, just accumulating money, because there was nothing else to do with it. This, he gestured around at the farm, at the house where Tommy was probably playing, at Eleanor herself. This is purpose. This is direction. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, and before James quite knew what was happening, she would stepped forward and hugged him, her face pressed against his chest, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. James stood frozen for a moment, then slowly, carefully, wrapped his arms around her, holding her, while she cried out months of fear and stress and loneliness. Thank you, she whispered against his shirt. Thank you, thank you, thank you. James rested his chin on top of her head, breathing in the scent of her hair that smelled like sunshine and herbs, feeling the way she fit against him as if she would be made for exactly this place. You do not have to thank me, he said quietly. This is what family does. They stood there for a long moment, holding each other in the garden, while the world went on around them, indifferent and eternal. When they finally separated, both were careful not to meet the other's eyes, the intimacy of the moment almost too much to acknowledge directly. I should get back to work, James said, his voice rougher than usual. And I should finish weeding, Eleanor agreed, but neither moved immediately. Eleanor, James said finally, about what I said. About family. I meant it. She looked up at him then, and what he saw in her eyes made his heart stutter. I meant it too, she whispered. The rest of the day passed in a blur of work and stolen glances, of ordinary tasks made extraordinary by the awareness humming between them. Tommy noticed something had changed. James could tell, but the boy seemed pleased rather than worried. as if he would been hoping for exactly this development. That evening, after supper, James made good on his promise. He retrieved Ulysses from town and brought the horse to the farm, leading him into the yard, where Tommy waited with barely contained excitement. "He is so big," Tommy breathed, his eyes huge as he stared up at the gelding. "He is gentle, though," James assured him. "Here, let me show you." He took Tommy's small hand and guided it to Ulysses's soft nose, showing him how to pet the horse properly. "See? He likes you." Tommy giggled as Ulysses's whiskers tickled his palm. "He is soft." "Can I really learn to ride him?" "We will start slow," James said. "First you need to learn how to be around horses, how to approach them, how to read their moods. Riding comes later, when you are comfortable, and he trusts you." Eleanor watched from the porch, her arms crossed but her expression soft, as James patiently taught her son about horses, about respect and caution, and the bond between human and animal. Watching them together, the tall man and the small boy, heads bent close as they examined Ulysses's hooves and talked about horseshoes, Eleanor felt something in her heart she would thought at. Hope, pure, undiluted hope for the future. As the sun set and the sky turned the color of embers, Tommy finally ran out of questions and energy simultaneously. Eleanor called him in for bed, and James led Ulysses to the barn, settling the horse for the night with feed and water, and a rub-down that was more meditation than necessity. He was finishing up when Eleanor appeared in the barn doorway, a lantern in her hand, casting dancing shadows on the walls. "He is asleep," she said softly. He was so excited he could barely settle down. "He made me promise 3 times that you would teach him more tomorrow." "I will," James said, hanging up the tack, "for as long as he wants to learn." Eleanor set the lantern on a post and moved closer, and James became acutely aware of how alone they were, how the darkness wrapped around them like a blanket, how the rest of the world seemed very far away. "James," she said quietly, "I need you to understand something. When Thomas died, I thought that was it for me. I thought I would had my chance at love, at partnership, at all those things people dream about. I thought I would spend the rest of my life just surviving, just making sure Tommy had what he needed." "Eleanor," James started, but she held up a hand. "Let me finish. What you did today, paying that debt, it was not just about money. It was about choosing us, choosing to invest in this family, in this future. And she took a deep breath. "I want you to know that I see it. I see what you are offering, what you are becoming to us, and it terrifies me." "I understand," James said, and he did. He was terrified too. "But," Eleanor continued, stepping closer still, "I think maybe being terrified is part of it, part of being brave enough to try again, to risk again." They were standing very close now, close enough that James could see the gold flecks in her eyes, the faint freckles across her nose, the way her lips trembled slightly as she spoke. Close enough that all he would have to do was lean down, just a little, and, "Mama?" Tommy's voice drifted from the house, sleepy and querulous. "I had a bad dream." The spell broke. Eleanor stepped back, laughing softly, shakily. "I should go to him." "Of course," James said, trying to ignore the disappointment flooding through him. Eleanor picked up the lantern and turned to go, then paused. "James, we have time. We do not have to rush anything." "No," James agreed. "We have time." But as she walked back to the house and he climbed to the loft, James found himself thinking that time was both a gift and a curse. Time to build something solid, something real, but also time for doubt to creep in, for old wounds to remind him why they would build walls in the first place. He lay in his makeshift bed, staring up at the stars, visible through the cracks in the barn roof, and allowed himself to imagine a future where this farm thrived, where Tommy grew strong and confident, where Eleanor smiled more than she worried, a future where maybe, just maybe, James Cordell could stop running from his past and start building towards something better. It was a dangerous thing to hope, he knew. Hope could shatter, could leave a man more broken than he would been before. But lying there in the darkness, listening to the soft sounds of the farm at rest, James decided that maybe some things were worth the risk. Maybe some people were worth staying for, even knowing that staying meant making yourself vulnerable to loss again. Maybe, just maybe, he could be brave enough to try. The weeks that followed took on a quality that James could only describe as golden, as if the late summer sun had somehow infused the very air with warmth and promise. The work continued, endless and demanding, but now it felt different, purposeful, in a way that went beyond simple survival. Every fence mended, every field tended, every small improvement made to the farm felt like a brick laid in the foundation of something permanent, something real. Tommy's riding lessons became a daily ritual, one that both the boy and James looked forward to with equal anticipation. They started slowly, just as James had promised, with Tommy learning to approach Ulysses properly, to read the horse's ears and posture, to move confidently but calmly around the large animal. The boy was fearless in his enthusiasm, but patient in his learning, soaking up every word James offered like parched earth drinking rain. "Can I sit on him today?" Tommy asked one afternoon, his small hand resting on Ulysses's shoulder, his face tilted up with desperate hope. James considered, noting how comfortable Tommy had become around the horse, how Ulysses had accepted the boy's presence with equine patience. "I think you are ready. But we will go slow, and I will be right there with you the whole time." Tommy's whoop of joy sent birds scattering from nearby trees. Eleanor, working in the garden, looked up with a smile that made James's chest tighten. She would been smiling more lately, the lines of worry around her eyes softening, her shoulders no longer carrying quite so much tension. It transformed her, that smile, turning her from merely pretty to genuinely beautiful. James led Ulysses to the fence and positioned him alongside it, so Tommy could climb up more easily. The boy scrambled up with the agility of youth, his excitement making him clumsy, and James steadied him with careful hands. "Easy now. Swing your leg over. That is it. Settle yourself in the saddle." James kept one hand on Tommy's back, the other on Ulysses's bridle. "How does it feel?" "I'm so high!" Tommy's voice was breathless with wonder. "I can see everything." "You are doing great. Now feel how he is standing, nice and steady. That is because he knows you are new, and he is being careful with you. Horses are smart that way." James began walking Ulysses slowly around the yard, keeping close, his hand never leaving Tommy's back. "The most important thing is balance. You move with the horse, not against him." They made several slow circuits of the yard, Tommy gradually relaxing into the rhythm, his initial tension giving way to growing confidence. Eleanor had stopped pretending to work, and was watching openly now, one hand pressed to her mouth, and James realized she was fighting tears. When they finally stopped, and James helped Tommy down, the boy was practically vibrating with excitement. "Did you see, Mama? Did you see? I was riding. A real cowboy." Eleanor caught her son in a fierce hug, and when she looked at James over Tommy's head, her eyes were indeed wet with tears. "Thank you," she mouthed silently. James nodded, feeling emotion thick in his own throat. This was what he would been missing, he realized. This sense of being part of something larger than himself, of contributing to someone else's joy, of mattering in ways that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with living. That night, after Tommy had been put to bed with strict instructions to dream about horses, James and Eleanor found themselves sitting on the porch steps together, watching the stars emerge, one by one in the darkening sky. It had become habit, these quiet moments at day's end, neither of them willing to acknowledge how much they would come to depend on this time together. "Amos taught me to ride," Eleanor said softly, breaking the comfortable silence. "When we were courting, I was terrified at first, convinced I would fall and break my neck. But he was patient, just like you are with Tommy. He made me feel safe enough to try." It was the first time she would spoken about her late husband without pain, shadowing her voice, and James took it as a gift, this sharing of memories. "He sounds like he was a good man," James said carefully. "He was." Eleanor pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders as the evening air cooled. But he is gone, and I am still here, and life keeps insisting on moving forward, whether I am ready or not. She turned to look at James directly. I think I am ready now. To move forward. Are you? The question hung between them, weighted with implications that went far beyond simple words. James thought about Sarah, about the guilt he would carried for 3 years, the sense that loving someone new would somehow be a betrayal of what he would had before. But sitting here with Eleanor, feeling the warmth of her presence, seeing the hope and fear warring in her eyes, he understood that the dead did not want to be chains holding the living in place. I think so, he said quietly. I am scared of it, but I think I am ready. Eleanor reached out and took his hand, her fingers threading through his with a naturalness that suggested they would been meant to fit together this way all along. Then we will be scared together, she said. That seems fair. They sat like that for a long time, hands joined, watching the stars wheel overhead in their ancient patterns, both of them feeling the weight and wonder of beginning again, of daring to hope for a future that included happiness. The peace could not last forever, though James wished it could. Trouble returned on a Saturday afternoon when James had ridden into town for supplies. He was loading bags of seed and flour into Ulysses's saddlebags when Robert Mitchell appeared, flanked by 2 men James recognized from that night at the farm. Cordell, Robert said, his voice carrying that peculiar mix of privilege and aggression that marked men who would never had to truly fight for anything. We need to have a conversation. James continued securing the supplies, not hurrying, but not stopping either. I am listening. You are making a mistake, getting involved with Eleanor Whitmore. She is spoken for, even if she does not know it yet. Robert moved closer, trying to use his size to intimidate. He was younger than James by several years, well-fed, and soft in the way of men who did more talking than working. The ladies made her feelings clear, James said evenly. Seems to me you are the one who is not listening. My father has plans for that property, good plans that would benefit the whole town. Your interference is costing people money, costing them opportunities. Robert's face was flushed with anger or drink or both. And Eleanor, she needs a proper husband, someone established, someone respectable, not some drifter with a gun and a sad story. James finished with the saddlebags and turned to face Robert fully, his expression calm, but his eyes hard. You done? I am trying to give you a chance to do the smart thing. Leave. Move on like you have probably done a dozen times before. There is nothing for you here. That is where you are wrong, James said quietly. There is everything for me here. Robert's companions shifted, their hands moving toward their belts, and James recognized the precursor to violence. He would seen it enough times in the war, that moment when men decided words were not sufficient and escalation became inevitable. I do not want trouble, James said, his voice carrying warning that only fools would ignore. God, I will not be driven off by threats or posturing. Mrs. Whitmore wants me there, and I am staying. We will see about that, Robert snarled, and lunged forward. What happened next was over in seconds. James sidestepped Robert's clumsy rush, caught the younger man's arm, and used his own momentum to send him sprawling into the dust. The 2 companions started forward, but James had his pistol out before they would take 2 steps. Do not, James said flatly. I have killed men in war, and I would regret having to do it now, but I will if you force my hand. They froze, reading the truth in his eyes, understanding that this was not bluster or bravado, but simple fact. Robert climbed to his feet, his face purple with humiliation and rage. You will pay for this, he spat. My father owns this town. We will make your life here hell. You are welcome to try, James said, holstering his weapon. But understand something. I am not some frightened widow you can bully, and I am not impressed by your father's money. I have faced worse than you in places you could not even imagine, and I am still standing. So if you want to keep pushing, know that I will push back harder. He mounted Ulysses and rode away, leaving Robert and his companions in the street. aware that he will just made the situation significantly worse, but unable to regret standing his ground. Some things were worth fighting for, and Eleanor and Tommy had become those things for him. When he arrived back at the farm, Eleanor took one look at his face and knew something had happened. Tommy was napping inside, and she pulled James around to the side of the house, out of earshot. What happened? James told her, leaving nothing out, watching her face cycle through fear and anger and resignation. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "I am bringing trouble to your door," James said. "Maybe it would be better if I—" "Do not you dare," Eleanor interrupted fiercely. "Do not you dare suggest leaving. Not now. Not after everything." Her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "I am so tired of being afraid of them, of letting them dictate how I live my life. Thomas used to say that fear is just another kind of prison, and I have been locked in it long enough. Eleanor, I do not want you or Tommy getting hurt because of me, and I do not want to spend the rest of my life running from bullies and cowards." She stepped closer, looking up at him with blazing eyes. "You stood up for us. You stood up for yourself. That is not bringing trouble, James. That is refusing to let trouble win." James wanted to argue, wanted to make her see the danger, but looking at her face, seeing the strength there, the determination, he understood that she was right. Leaving would not solve anything. It would just be another kind of surrender. "All right," he said finally, "but we need to be careful. Mitchell's not going to let this go. Then we will deal with whatever comes, together." Eleanor reached up and touched his face, her hand gentle against his cheek. "I am done being alone, James. I am done pretending I can do everything myself. If you are offering partnership, real partnership, then I am accepting. I am offering," James said, covering her hand with his own. "Whatever that means, whatever it takes." They stood like that for a moment, the afternoon sun warm on their backs, and then Eleanor rose on her toes and kissed him, soft and brief, but full of promise. It was the first kiss, tentative and sweet, and when they pulled apart, both were smiling, despite the shadows gathering on the horizon. The next few weeks brought changes both subtle and profound. James moved from the barn loft to a small room off the kitchen that had been Thomas's study, a move that was practical and proper, but still felt significant, like another step toward permanence. He began teaching Tommy not just about horses, but about the farm itself, about when to plant and when to harvest, about reading the weather and respecting the land, passing on knowledge that had been passed to him long ago. Eleanor bloomed under the shared burden of work, her movements becoming lighter, her laughter coming more easily. They fell into rhythms of partnership, anticipating each other's needs, working in tandem with an efficiency that spoke of growing intimacy. Sometimes James would look up from his work to find her watching him, and the expression on her face made his heart stutter, with hope and fear in equal measure. They were careful about propriety, aware of how small towns talked, how appearances mattered for Eleanor's reputation and Tommy's well-being. But in stolen moments, in the brush of hands passing tools, in the way they lingered over evening conversations, in the occasional kiss shared when Tommy was asleep, and the world seemed to consist of just the two of them, their connection deepened and strengthened. Tommy, for his part, thrived. The shadows under his eyes faded. His laughter rang out more frequently. He followed James like a devoted shadow, asking endless questions, offering to help with every task, proudly announcing to anyone who would listen that he was learning to be a cowboy. The change in the boy was remarkable, as if James's presence had given him permission to be a child again, to feel safe enough to play and dream. One evening, as James was teaching Tommy to braid rope, the boy looked up at him with those serious eyes and asked, "Are you going to marry my mama?" James's hands stilled on the rope. Eleanor, who had been cooking dinner, went very quiet at the stove. The question hung in the air, innocent and enormous. "Would that be all right with you?" James asked carefully. "If I did?" Tommy considered this with the gravity of a judge pronouncing verdict. "I think so. Papa would not want Mama to be sad forever. And you make her smile. You make both of us smile." Your papa sounds like he was very wise, James said, his throat tight. He was. Tommy returned his attention to the rope, his small fingers working to copy James's movements. But he is gone, and you are here. Mama says sometimes God takes people away, but brings new people to help us. Maybe that is what you are, the person God brought to help. James looked up and met Eleanor's eyes across the room. She was watching him with an expression of such tenderness, such hope, that he felt something in his chest unlock and expand. Maybe I am, James said quietly. That night, after Tommy was in bed, James found Eleanor on the porch, and without preamble, without fancy words or elaborate planning, he took her hands in his and said, "Marry me." Eleanor's eyes widened. "James, I know it is fast. I know people will talk. I know there are 100 reasons we should wait." James squeezed her hands gently. "But I also know that I love you, that I love Tommy, that I want to spend whatever days I have left making this farm thrive and this family strong. I am not Thomas, and I will not try to be. But I can be James, and I can be yours, for will have me." Tears streaked down Eleanor's face, catching the moonlight. "Are you sure? Really sure? Because once we do this, there is no going back. You will be tied to this place, to us, to all the complications that come with it. I'm already tied to you," James said simply. "Have been since that first day when I walked through that gate. The question is whether you want me permanently, or if you would rather I stayed as hired help who happens to be in love with you." Eleanor laughed through her tears, a sound of pure joy. "That seems impractical." "Very," James agreed, smiling. "Yes," Eleanor said, pulling her hands free so she could frame his face with her palms. "Yes, I will marry you. Yes, to all of it. The complications and the ties and the permanence. Yes." James kissed her then, properly this time, without hesitation or holding back, and Eleanor kissed him back with equal fervor, both of them pouring 3 years of loneliness and grief and gradual healing into the connection. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathless and smiling. "We should tell Tommy," Eleanor said. "Tomorrow," James replied. "Tonight, let us just be us, for a little while longer." They sat together on the porch steps, Eleanor's head on James' shoulder, his arm around her waist, watching the stars and making quiet plans for a future that felt both impossibly fragile and miraculously solid. When they told Tommy the next morning, the boy's reaction was everything they could have hoped for. He whooped with joy, threw his arms around James's legs, and immediately began planning what he would wear to the wedding, and whether there would be cake. "Does this mean you will be my papa?" Tommy asked, suddenly serious. James knelt down to the boy's level, wanting to get this right. "I cannot replace your papa, Tommy. He will always be your father, always be important. But if you want, I can be your papa too. You can have both in your heart." Tommy thought about this, then nodded decisively. "I want that. Can I call you papa?" "I would be honored," James said, his voice rough with emotion. Tommy launched himself into James's arms, and James held him tight, this small boy who had lost so much, but was brave enough to love again, to trust again. Over Tommy's head he met Eleanor's eyes, and saw his own overwhelming joy reflected back at him. They married quietly 2 weeks later in the small church in Sweetwater, with only Mrs. Henderson and the Reverend as witnesses. Eleanor wore her best dress, the blue one she saved for special occasions, with wildflowers in her hair, that Tommy had picked that morning. James wore his cleanest clothes, and the look of a man who could not quite believe his good fortune. The ceremony was simple and brief, the words traditional but made meaningful by the weight of everything that had brought them to this moment. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, and James kissed his bride, he felt 3 years of wandering finally come to rest, felt himself finally home. Carl Mitchell made his displeasure known, of course, through pointed snubs and business denied. But enough of the townspeople, the decent ones who judged by character rather than bank accounts, accepted the new family with cautious warmth. Henderson hosted a small celebration at the boarding house, and several neighboring farmers stopped by to offer congratulations and a willingness to help with the harvest when the time came. The harvest itself came a few weeks later, and it was hard, back-breaking work that left everyone exhausted. But the community, perhaps sensing that the Cordells represented something important about resilience and new beginnings, turned out to help. Even some of Mitchell's workers came in their off hours, unwilling to let a good harvest go to waste over their employer's petty grievances. Tommy worked alongside the adults, doing whatever his small hands could manage, proud to be contributing. James watched him dart between workers, offering water and encouragement, and felt a fierce swell of pride. This was his son now, not by blood, but by choice, and that made it somehow more precious. When the harvest was finally brought in, tallied and stored and sold, the numbers were better than Eleanor had dared hope. Not enough to make them wealthy, but enough to pay the next several mortgage payments, to buy seed for spring planting, to breathe easier, for the first time in over a year. That night, the three of them sat on the porch, tired and dirty and happy. Tommy was half asleep against James's side, and Eleanor held James's hand, her head on his shoulder. "We did it," she murmured. "We actually did it." "We did," James agreed. "And we will do it again next year, and the year after that. Promise?" Tommy mumbled, his eyes already closed. "Promise," James said, and this time the word did not frighten him. Promises were not chains or curses. They were choices, renewed each day by actions and commitment and love. The seasons turned as seasons do, and the Cordell family settled into their life together with a contentment that felt earned rather than given. Winter brought its challenges, cold that seeped into bones and work that had to be done regardless of weather. But it also brought cozy evenings by the fire, with Tommy learning his letters while Eleanor mended, and James carved small wooden animals that gradually populated the boy's shelf. Spring arrived with mud and rain, and the promise of rebirth. James taught Tommy to plant, to space the seeds properly, to pat the earth gently over each one. They worked side by side, the man and the boy, while Eleanor managed the chickens and the kitchen garden, and anyone watching would have seen a family no different from dozens of others scraping out a living on the Kansas prairie. But they were different, at least to themselves. They were three people who had been broken and had somehow found a way to fit their jagged pieces together into something whole. They were proof that endings could become beginnings, that loss did not have to be permanent, that love was possible even after hope seemed dead. On a warm day in early summer, nearly a year after James had first walked through the gate, Tommy came running from town, where Eleanor had sent him, on an errand. He burst into the yard where James was repairing the chicken coop, his face flushed with excitement and something else, something that made James set down his tools immediately. "Papa, there is people in town. They were asking about you." James felt a cold fist close around his heart. "What kind of people?" "Soldiers." "Well, one soldier. He had a uniform and everything." Mommy bounced with excitement. "He said he knew you from the war. Said he has been looking for you." James's mind raced through possibilities, through names and faces from a past he would tried so hard to leave behind. "Did he say what he wanted?" "He gave Mrs. Henderson letter for you. She sent me to fetch you to town." Tommy grabbed James's hand, tugging. "Come on. Maybe he has stories about when you were a soldier." Eleanor appeared from the house, wiping her hands on her apron, and James saw understanding dawn in her eyes. "James, what is wrong?" "I do not know yet," he said honestly. "Maybe nothing. But I need to go to town." "I will come with you," Eleanor said immediately. "No." James softened the word with a gentle touch to her arm. "Stay here with Tommy. I will be back as soon as I can, and I will tell you everything." He rode into Sweetwater with a sense of dread pooling in his gut, wondering what ghosts from his past had finally caught up with him. Henderson met him at the boarding house, her face concerned as she handed him an envelope bearing official markings. James opened it with hands that wanted to shake and read the contents twice before the words fully registered. It was from the War Department, informing him that a clerical error had been discovered. He was owed back pay from his service, a sum that had been lost in the chaos of demobilization, and only recently uncovered during an audit. The soldier who had been looking for him was simply trying to deliver the good news and arrange for the payment to be transferred. James stood there in Mrs. Henderson's parlor, staring at the letter, feeling laughter bubble up from somewhere deep in his chest. All this dread, all this fear that his past had come to destroy his present, and instead it had brought an unexpected gift. The amount listed would be enough to pay off the mortgage entirely, with money left over for improvements and expansions they would only dreamed about. "Mr. Cordell?" Mrs. Henderson ventured. "Is everything all right?" "Yes," James said, and meant it with his whole heart. "Everything is more than all right." The soldier, a young man named Peters who had served in a different unit, but had friends who had known James's reputation as a steady, reliable fighter, was found at the saloon. He shook James's hand enthusiastically and explained the process for claiming the payment. It would take a few weeks, but the money was definitely his, no strings attached. "You are a hard man to track down," Peters said cheerfully, "but I am glad I found you. Word in the regiment was you were one of the good ones, sir. Deserved better than what the war gave most of us." James thanked him and rode back to the farm, his mind whirling with possibilities. When he told Eleanor and Tommy the news, Eleanor cried again, but this time purely from relief and joy. "We can pay off the mortgage," she kept saying. "We can actually pay it off. We will really own this place free and clear." "We will," James confirmed, pulling her close. "And then we will start building, maybe expand the house, add another room for when Tommy gets bigger, fix up the barn properly, maybe even get some cattle, try our hand at ranching." "Can we get more horses?" Tommy asked, hopefully. "I am getting really good at riding." "Maybe," James said, ruffling the boy's hair. "We will see what makes sense." When the payment finally came through, James made a point of going to the bank personally, with Eleanor and Tommy beside him. Carl Mitchell's face as James counted out the full mortgage amount was a study in displeasure and grudging respect. The man had no choice but to mark the debt satisfied, to hand over the deed free and clear. "You have done well for yourself," Mitchell said stiffly. "I will not pretend I am happy about it." "I do not need you to be happy about it," James replied evenly. "I just need you to leave my family alone." Mitchell looked at the three of them, this unlikely family forged from loss and choice, and something in his expression shifted slightly. "Your family?" he repeated. "Yes, I suppose they are." They walked out of the bank as landowners, truly and completely, and the feeling was indescribable. This was not just about money or property. It was about security, about permanence, about the future stretching ahead without the sword of foreclosure hanging over their heads. That night, they celebrated with a special dinner, Tommy getting to stay up past his bedtime, all of them giddy with relief and hope. James held Eleanor close as they stood on the porch later, watching fireflies dance in the darkness. "I never thought I would have this again," Eleanor whispered. "A partner, someone to share the burdens and the joys, someone who chose us, who fights for us." "I never thought I would want it again," James admitted. "I thought that part of my life was over, that I would spend the rest of my days alone, but then a widow and her son reminded me what I was living for." They stood in comfortable silence for a while. Eleanor said softly, "There is something I need to tell you. I was not sure before, but now I am." James turned to look at her, noting the slight nervousness in her expression, the way she held herself. "What is it?" "I am pregnant," Eleanor said simply. "We are going to have a baby." The words hit James like a physical force. A baby, his baby, theirs together, a child who would grow up knowing only this family, this love, this security they would build from broken pieces. The enormity of it overwhelmed him, and he found himself blinking back tears. "Eleanor," he managed, pulling her close. "Are you sure?" "I am sure." She wrapped her arms around him. "I know we did not plan it, and maybe the timing is not perfect, but the timing is exactly right," James interrupted. "Everything about this is right." Tommy appeared in the doorway, rubbing his eyes. Why is everybody crying? Is something wrong? No, sweetie, Eleanor said, reaching out to include him in their embrace. Everything's wonderful. You're going to be a big brother. Tommy's eyes went wide, and then he was jumping up and down with excitement, already talking about what he would teach the baby, how he would protect them, whether it would be a brother or a sister, and which would be better. James held his family close, this miracle of second chances, and felt the last of his old wounds finally beginning to heal. He thought about Sarah, about the children they would never had, and he sent a silent prayer of gratitude into the universe for the path that had led him here, to this porch, to these people, to this life he would never imagine wanting. The months that followed were busy with preparation and anticipation. James built a cradle, spending hours in the barn carefully shaping wood, determined that this baby would have something beautiful made with love. Tommy helped enthusiastically, for not always effectively, and James taught him to sand the wood smooth, to respect the tools, to take pride in work well done. Eleanor bloomed with pregnancy despite the usual discomforts, and James found himself marveling daily at the miracle of new life growing, at the way Tommy would talk to his mother's expanding belly, telling his future sibling about the farm and the horses, and his papa, who could do anything. Can he really do anything? Eleanor teased one evening after overhearing one of these conversations. Of course, James said with mock seriousness. Have not you noticed? She laughed and swatted him playfully, and moments like these, simple and domestic and full of joy, were worth more than all the gold in California. The baby came on a cold winter night, with Miss Henderson serving as midwife and James pacing the kitchen. While Tommy slept through the drama upstairs, the hours stretched endlessly, every cry from Eleanor making James's heart clench with fear and helplessness. But when dawn finally broke and Miss Henderson appeared with a small bundle, her face wreathed in smiles, James felt his knees go weak with relief. You have a daughter, Mrs. Henderson announced. A beautiful, healthy daughter. And Eleanor came through just fine. James climbed the stairs on shaking legs, entering the bedroom to find Eleanor propped against pillows, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny scrap of humanity wrapped in a blanket. She looked up at him with tears streaming down her face. Come meet your daughter, she whispered. James approached slowly, reverently, looking down at the impossibly small face, the delicate features, the tiny hands that waved aimlessly. Something in his chest cracked wide open, a rush of love so fierce it was almost painful. She is perfect, he managed, his voice breaking. You are perfect. Want to hold her? James nodded, unable to speak, and Eleanor carefully transferred the precious bundle into his arms. The baby weighed nothing and everything simultaneously, and James found himself making silent promises to this tiny person who did not even know he existed yet. He promised to protect her, to provide for her, to be the kind of father she deserved. He promised to love her mother, to love her brother, to make this family strong enough to weather whatever storms might come. What should we name her? Eleanor asked softly. James looked down at his daughter, this miracle of hope, new beginnings, and knew immediately. Grace, he said, because she is a gift we did not deserve, but received anyway. Grace Sarah Cordell, Eleanor added, including James's first wife in the blessing, acknowledging that love did not diminish by being shared, but grew stronger. James looked up at her with shining eyes. Thank you. When Tommy woke and came to meet his sister, his face showed such wonder and immediate devotion that both adults had to fight fresh tears. He insisted on holding her right away, and with careful supervision, they let him, this 4-year-old boy, who had known loss cradling this new life, with the gentleness of someone far older. I will take care of her, Tommy said solemnly. I will be the best big brother ever. I know you will, James said, and meant it. The years continued their relentless forward march, and the Cordell family grew and thrived along with the farm. Grace was followed by a son they named William, and then another daughter they called Anne. The house expanded to accommodate the growing family, and additional rooms were built with boards that no longer leaked and roofs that kept out the rain. Tommy grew tall and strong, becoming the kind of young man any father would be proud of. Someone who worked hard and treated people with respect, and looked after his younger siblings with fierce protectiveness. He learned to be a remarkable horseman, and he never forgot those early lessons about promises and strength and choosing to stay, even when leaving would be easier. The farm prospered, not lavishly but steadily, supporting them through good years and bad. James became a respected member of the community, known for his fairness and his skill with horses and his willingness to help neighbors when they needed it. Eleanor transformed from a frightened widow into a confident woman who ran her household with efficiency and love, who raised her children with wisdom and patience, who looked at her husband each morning as if still slightly amazed by their shared good fortune. Carl Mitchell eventually moved away, his influence in town diminishing as people grew tired of his manipulations. Robert married someone else and left Kansas entirely, and the Cordells were able to buy additional land at good prices when it became available. The farm that had once been a struggling venture became one of the most productive in the region. But for all the external success, the real wealth was in the quiet moments. Tommy teaching his little brother to ride, the same way James had taught him. Grace learning to bake with her mother, flour dusting them both, Anne toddling after her father in the fields, determined to help, even though she was barely big enough to carry a single ear of corn. The whole family gathered around the table for meals, talking and laughing, and sometimes arguing, but always, always, together. On the 10th anniversary of the day James first walked through that gate, he and Eleanor stood in the yard and looked at everything they would build. The house was larger now, freshly painted. The barn was solid and well-maintained. The field stretched green and promising. Children's voices rang out from somewhere nearby, engaged in some game only they understood. "Do you ever regret it?" Eleanor asked quietly. "Stopping here? Staying?" James pulled her close. This woman, who would given him back his life, his purpose, his future, not for a single moment. This, right here, this is everything I was looking for, without knowing I was looking for it. Even with all the hard times, the work, worry, the times when it felt like we might not make it, especially because of those times, James said firmly. Easy lives do not teach us what we are capable of, and I learned that I am capable of a lot more than I thought. That we are capable of a lot more together than we ever could have been alone. Eleanor smiled, that smile that still made his heart skip beats even after all these years. Tommy asked me something yesterday. He wanted to know how we knew we were meant to be a family. What did you tell him? I told him that sometimes the best families are not the ones we are born into, but the ones we choose, the ones we build from love and commitment and choosing each other every single day. Eleanor looked up at James. Was that the right answer? It was perfect, James assured her. Just like you, just like this. Tommy came running then, nearly grown now at 14, with Grace and William and Anne trailing behind him. "Papa, Mama, come quick. Ulysses got out again, and he is in Mrs. Henderson's garden." James groaned, but could not help smiling. The old horse, still stubborn after all these years, had a fondness for Mrs. Henderson's vegetables that no amount of fencing seemed able to contain. "I will go," James said, but Eleanor caught his hand. "We will go together," she corrected, "like always." And so the Cordell family set off down the road together, all 5 of them, heading toward town to rescue Mrs. Henderson's garden from a mischievous horse who refused to act his age. The U.S. Macrupper Prophet Promoter Fumber 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 James listened to the sounds of his family, the laughter at questions, and small arguments over who would get to lead Ulysses back, and felt something he would never quite manage to name settle into his bones. It was not happiness exactly, though there was plenty of that. It was not just contentment, though he had that too. It was something deeper, something that felt like coming home after a long journey, like finding a place in the world that fit the exact shape of your soul. Mrs. Henderson was standing in her ravaged garden when they arrived, hands on her hips, trying to look stern, but failing because Ulysses had somehow gotten himself tangled in her clothesline and looked so pathetically pleased with himself that it was impossible to stay angry. "That horse is a menace," Mrs. Henderson declared, but her eyes were twinkling. "A complete and utter menace." "I'm so sorry," Eleanor said, trying not to laugh. "We will pay for any damage, of course." "Oh, nonsense. He barely touched anything important. Besides," Miss Henderson's expression softened as she looked at the family gathered in her yard. "Watching you all come down that road together, that was payment enough. You are a beautiful family, Eleanor. You and James have built something special here." James finally got Ulysses untangled, with help from Tommy, who would become quite skilled at handling horses over the years. As they led the old gelding back toward home, Mrs. Henderson called after them, "James, a moment?" James handed Ulysses's laid rope to Tommy and walked back to where the older woman stood. She reached out and patted his arm, her weathered hand gentle. "I remember when you first came to town," she said quietly. "You looked like a man who had lost everything and was not sure he wanted to find anything again. Look at you now." James glanced back at his family, at Eleanor helping Anne pick wildflowers by the roadside, at Tommy showing Grace and William how to check Ulysses's hooves for stones, at the life he would somehow been blessed enough to stumble into. "I was lost," James admitted. "Did not even know how lost, until I found my way here." "That little boy," Mrs. Henderson said, nodding toward Tommy. "Do you remember what he asked you? That day when he was so small, when you had barely been here a week?" James thought back, trying to recall. But the early days were a blur of work and wariness and walls he would been trying so hard to maintain. Mrs. Henderson smiled at his confusion. "He asked me if you were staying, and when I said I did not know, he said something I've never forgotten. He said, 'I hope so. I think maybe he could be my papa if he wanted to.' That was before you had even spoken to him more than a handful of times." James felt his throat tighten. "I did not know that. Children see things we adults miss sometimes. They see the heart beneath all the armor we wear." Mrs. Henderson squeezed his arm once more. "That boy knew you were his papa before you did, and you proved him right every single day since." James looked back at Tommy again. This young man who started as a frightened 4-year-old, clutching a wooden horse and asking him impossible questions about whether dreams were real. Tommy caught his eye and waved, grinning, completely unself-conscious, in the way of those who would never doubted they were loved. "Thank you," James said to Mrs. Henderson, "for everything. For that first night when I needed a place to stay, for being kind to Eleanor when others were not, for being part of our story." "Oh, my dear boy," Mrs. Henderson said, her own eyes misting now. "Thank you for letting an old woman watch miracles unfold. That is what you are, you know, all of you together, a miracle." As they walked home, the afternoon sun warm on their backs and Ulysses plodding contentedly between them, James found himself thinking about miracles and second chances, about the way life could surprise you when you least expected it, about how the best things often came disguised as ordinary days that turned out to be anything but. That evening, after the children were in bed and the house had settled into nighttime quiet, James and Eleanor sat on their porch, as they did most nights, watching the stars emerge like promises kept, like prayers answered, in ways neither had dared to imagine. "Do you think about her?" Eleanor asked softly. Sarah. It was the first time in months that either had spoken the name, and James was surprised to find that it did not hurt the way it once had. The grief was still there, would always be there in some form, but it had transformed into something gentler, something that could coexist with joy. "Sometimes," James admitted. "Usually, when I am happy, which seems strange. But I think that is when I miss her most, wishing she could see what I have built, what we have built, wishing she could know that I am all right, that I found my way through. Do you think she would approve?" There was no jealousy in Eleanor's question, just genuine curiosity, a desire to honor the woman who would come before. James considered carefully. "I think she would be glad. I'm not alone anymore." She always said life was meant to be shared, that love multiplied instead of divided. When you gave it away, she would love you, he added, pulling Eleanor closer. "And she would love our children. Of that, I am certain." "I wish I could have known her," Eleanor said. "And I wish you could have known Thomas as he was before he got hurt, before fear and pain changed him. He was funny and kind, and so full of dreams. He lives on in Tommy," James observed. "I see it sometimes, in the way the boy tilts his head when he is thinking, or how he approaches problems methodically. Those are gifts from his first father, and from you," Eleanor insisted. "His patience, his confidence, his sense of right and wrong, those are all you, James." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts, until Eleanor spoke again. "What is the best part?" she asked. "Of all of this, what is the best part for you?" James thought about the question, about all the moments, large and small, that filled the past 10 years. The harvest celebrations and quiet mornings, the first steps and first words, the crises weathered and victories celebrated, the ordinary days that strung together into an extraordinary life. "The noise," he said finally, and Eleanor laughed, surprised. The noise, James confirmed. "After Sarah died, after the war, my life was so quiet, too quiet. The silence was like a weight, crushing me a little more each day. But here, there is always noise. Children laughing, you singing while you cook, arguments over whose turn it is to feed the chickens, bedtime stories, Tommy practicing his reading out loud, the baby crying, all of it. The noise means life. It means family. It means I am not alone anymore." Eleanor leaned into him, her head finding its familiar place on his shoulder. "I love you, James Cordell. I do not say it enough, but I do. I love you for staying when you could have left, for choosing us when you could have chosen the easier path of staying alone, for being brave enough to love again." "I love you too," James said, the words coming easily now, though they would been so hard at first. "And I was not brave. I was terrified. Still ask sometimes, when I think about how much I have to lose now, but at the price of love, is not it? The fear of loss, and it is worth it. Every single day, it is worth it." They stayed on the porch until the night grew cool and the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient dance, neither wanting to break the spell of the moment, both understanding that these quiet times together were as precious as any of the more dramatic moments that punctuated their shared life. When they finally went inside, James checked on each of the children as he did every night, a ritual he would started with Tommy and continued with each subsequent child. Tommy was sprawled across his bed, all gangly teenage limbs, growing so fast, James could barely keep him in clothes that fit. Grace slept curled on her side, her hand tucked under her cheek, looking angelic in repose, though she was anything but, during waking hours. William had kicked off his covers as usual, and James gently replaced them, knowing they would be on the floor again by morning. And Anne, the baby, though she was not really a baby anymore, slept with her thumb in her mouth, and her other hand clutching the stuffed horse James had made her, a crude echo of the wooden one Tommy still kept on his shelf. Standing there in the doorway of Anne's room, looking at his sleeping daughter, James was ambushed by memory. He thought about that first morning in the barn loft, when he would awaken to find a small boy staring at him, asking if he was real, saying that sometimes people in dreams disappeared. He thought about how close he would come to leaving, to saddling Ulysses and riding away before he could get attached, before these people could work their way into his broken heart. What would have happened if we'd left? Where would he be now? Probably still drifting, still running, still trying to outpace grief and guilt, and the terrible weight of surviving when so many others had not. He would have missed all of this, the morning chaos and evening peace, the scraped knees and hurt feelings he would learn to bandage and soothe, the pride of watching Tommy become a man, the wonder of holding his own children, the daily miracle of Eleanor's love. He would have missed his life, the real one, the one that had been waiting for him here all along, if he would just been brave enough to stop running and stay. "Papa?" A small voice from Anne's bed. She would woken was watching him with sleepy eyes. "What are you doing?" "Just checking on you, sweetheart. Go back to sleep. Will you tell me about the cowboy?" Anne asked, the request she made most nights, wanting to hear the story that had become family legend. James sat on the edge of her bed, smoothing her hair back from her forehead. "Once upon a time," he began, the words familiar and comforting, "there was a cowboy who was lost. He rode and rode, looking for something, but not knowing what. And then one day, he came to a farm with a white fence, and he met a brave mama and a little boy who asked him a question." What question? Nan asked, even though she knew, even though she would heard this story 100 times. The little boy asked, "Can you be my papa?" And the cowboy was scared, because he would lost so much already. But he looked at that little boy and that brave mama, and he knew that some questions are really invitations. So instead of riding away, he stayed. And slowly, day by day, he stopped being lost and started being found. "And then he became my papa too," Anne added sleepily, her eyes already closing again. "And then I became your papa too," James confirmed softly. "Best decision I ever made." But Anne was already asleep again, her breathing deep and even, and James sat there for a moment longer, thinking about the story he would just told, the simplified version that turned 10 years of struggle and growth, and learning how to be a family into a fairy tale with a happy ending. Except it was not really a fairy tale, was it? It was better than that. It was real. It was messy and hard and beautiful and true. It was ordinary people making extraordinary choices every single day, choosing love over fear, choosing to stay over the easier option of leaving, choosing to build something together that none of them could have built alone. James stood and walked quietly from Anne's room, down the hallway past the other sleeping children, into the bedroom he shared with Eleanor. She was already in bed, reading by lamplight, as she looked up when he entered, her smile welcoming him home. "Everything all right?" she asked. "Everything's perfect," James said, and meant it without reservation. He got ready for bed, moving through the familiar routine. And as he climbed under the covers beside his wife, as she set aside her book and turned down the lamp, as they settled into their usual sleeping positions, with her back against his chest and his arm around her waist, James sent up a silent prayer of gratitude. "Thank you," he thought, not sure who he was thanking, but needing to express it anyway. "Thank you for that day when I was too tired to keep riding, when I stopped in a nothing town called Sweetwater. Thank you for the old man who mentioned a widow needing help. Thank you for giving me the courage to walk through that gate. Thank you for Eleanor and Tommy, for second chances and new beginnings, for teaching me that the heart has more capacity than we ever imagine, that love does not run out, but rather expands to fill whatever space we give it. I love you," he whispered into Eleanor's hair. "I love you too," she murmured back, already half asleep. "My cowboy who stayed." And there it was, the truest thing that had ever been said about him. He was the cowboy who stayed, not the war hero, not the skilled horseman, not the man who could fix anything with his hands. He was simply the man who, when faced with the choice between running and staying, between isolation and connection, between fear and love, had chosen to stay. It was the simplest choice, and the hardest one, and he would had to make it, not just once, but over and over, every day for 10 years. And he would keep making it, every day for the rest of his life, because this was where he belonged. This was what he would be searching for without knowing it. This was home. Outside, the Kansas wind whispered through the grass, the same endless prairie wind that had been blowing long before James arrived, and would blow long after he was gone. But for now, in this moment, in this house full of sleeping children that quiet love and second chances made real, James Cordell was exactly where he was meant to be. The cowboy who would been lost had found his way home, and in finding home, he would found himself. Sometimes life offers us exactly what we need in the moment we need it most, if only we are brave enough to recognize it, to reach out and take hold of it, to say yes to the possibility of beginning again. For James, that moment had come on a dusty street in a small Kansas town, when a man mentioned a widow who needed help. For Eleanor, it had been the moment she would decided to trust a stranger with her farm and, eventually, her heart. For Tommy, it had been a child's instinctive knowledge that this sad man with the gentle hands might be the answer to prayers he would been too young to articulate. And for all of them together, it had been every day since, every choice to love instead of fear, every decision to build instead of abandon, every moment of choosing each other again and again, until the choosing became as natural as breathing. That is what family is, really. Not just the ties of blood, though those matter too. Family is the people who choose you, keep choosing you, who see you at your worst and love you anyway, who stand beside you through the storms and celebrate with you in the sunshine. Family is the cowboy who stays, the widow who trusts again, the child who asks the impossible question and receives an answer written in years of daily devotion.